Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm adopting a new approach to our videos. They're going to be shorter, they're going to be snappier, and my staff tell me I'm much more approachable if I look like I'm on a Hawaiian holiday and I smile even more. Today's topic is going to be about economic paradoxes explained, and I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. So let me start. Economic paradox is a brief definition of trying to explain how Singapore grows despite having some peculiarities which, if they were present in other countries, would create significant political challenges and may be difficult to sustain over a period of time. So let's start with the assumption that economics is what makes Singapore tick. And economics can be reduced to one simple concept, GDP, or gross domestic product, which is defined as the economic activity that produces, in quantifiable terms, all the goods and services within a given year. Now, there is a comparable statistic called, alternative statistic called gross national income, which is the measure of all quantifiable goods and services produced by Singapore registered companies produced anywhere in the world. And there's a big difference between our GDP number and our GNI number, but our GNI number is never published publicly. The GNI number is the result of investments that we generate from, say, our GLCs overseas, as well as our SWFs, investment deployments. And that helps explain why Singapore can afford to keep growing its reserves at a rate which, again, isn't publicly disclosed. But as we've known from the last 4 budgets, we can suddenly tap over $90 billion of it. Now, going back in history, there was a particular gentleman called Dr. Goh Keng Swee, also known as the architect of our economic success story through the 1970s and 1980s. Even though he stepped down from politics in 1984, he observed that one of the illusions is that politicians and civil servants assume they can perform entrepreneurial functions despite all the evidence to the contrary. Singapore continues to persist with master or command economic planning to an extent by coming up with these elaborate plans every time we have a crisis. Today we have the Future Economic Council, we have the Emerging Stronger Task Force, we have the new Council on Wages under Senior Minister Tharman. That's probably not the end of the story. He also observed, though, in 1972, in that same year, that if Singapore continued to rely on the presence of multinationals in our economy as a way to grow it, within 10 to 15 years, we could describe ourselves as economic failure. And there are reasons for that. That's because we would have failed to have produced our own domestic champions whose interests were aligned with the country and whose presence in Singapore would be sticky. Now, let's talk specifically about growth in GDP. Now, GDP is a very imperfect measure of growth. It dates back to the 1920s. We won't go into the detail of the formula of GDP, but suffice to say that when we consider GDP and when we talk about quality GDP, what we're really talking about is it being value adding, which means that outputs, the value of the outputs are greater than the value of the factor inputs. It has to be measurable. It can't be just simply notional. And in the Singapore case, there's a particular challenge because 75% of our GDP is export orientated. So our growth is really dependent on the growth of supply and demand countries that we service, and very little on what we actually do internally, despite all of the hype over the 4 budgets. Those support really 25% of our economy, although of course a good proportion of that goes toward trying to ensure that the companies can be export orientated. And our productivity really matters, because productivity is what makes the difference between inputs and outputs without significant capital investments having to be the solution. The challenge is Singapore's and most advanced economies have very low productivity, but that's a story for another video. Now, when we talk about GDP, we can talk about it as a stock or we can talk about it as a flow. Academics and people who sit in universities and write books talk about GDP as a stock. GDP per year was X. But practitioners of economic planning and policymakers and politicians have to think about GDP as a flow. In other words, GDP change. And GDP change is a much simpler formula than measuring GDP itself. It's essentially the sum of the changes to the size of the labor force and the changes to the size of productivity. What this means is you've got three options. You can either supercharge your GDP growth by force-feeding your labor force, which is what we did between 2005 and 2009, which created asset class inflation as well as general inflation. Or we can increase productivity changes, which we've tried to do over 10 years and intentionally failed because productivity is extraordinarily low in Singapore, particularly labor force productivity. Or you could do both, which would be great. But we haven't been able to do both for at least 20 years, which is not great. Now, Singapore's GDP growth has been declining over the whole of the past decade. Now, the government likes to use 2010 as a starting point rather than 2009 because our performance in 2009 was badly affected by the crisis, whereas we had a bounce back at the last quarter of 2009 and 2010 looked really great. Essentially, if we were playing a statistical game, we achieve 1/3 or more of our productivity targets in one single year in 2010 for a 10-year period. But that's just statistics for you. Now, if we look at this particular trend line, that's the problem. The word is the trend. It is declining, it is sustained, it is secular, and in 2019, we have 0.7% real GDP growth. Now, the government forecast, revised forecast for 2020 is -4% to -7%. At FMG, our revised forecast is -5% to -10%. Before the government did its revision, its forecast was -1% to -4%, and our forecast was -4% to -8%. So there are reasons for why our numbers are more conservative, but we won't go into that in this particular video because we've only got 5 minutes. Now, one of the characteristics about growth in Singapore is our heavy dependency on foreign direct investment. In fact, we are one of the top countries in the world in terms of attracting FDI, and that seems like a very good thing, and to a large extent, it is. Without FDI, we wouldn't really have the affluence and the modernity that we enjoy today. But it brings with it some strings. We become dependent on the sources of this FDI. We become dependent on in ways that require us to start to please them, to incentivize them, to retain them, to seduce them. All the things that we do for them that we don't do for SMEs in Singapore. And certainly we don't do in the same way or the same degree. And that creates a certain inequity that helps explain why there is distortion in the wage markets. There's also difficulty in finding SMEs that have become successful on the same scale. But again, story for another video. Now, another thing about Singapore, which is very peculiar, is that we depend heavily on something called net investment returns contribution, NIRC, which is not your little card that identifies you as a citizen or as a employment pass holder, but what we cream off from the gains, the long-term returns of our sovereign wealth funds. And if you look at this from the budget 2020, you will see that our net investment return was 17, reliance on and that as a source of revenue was 17 billion out of a budget of 74 billion. For those of you who can do the math, that's not a small amount, right? That's 15 to 20%. But what you look at to the right of the picture and you see that our change in terms of dependency has grown significantly. And that change is is over 9%. And so the rate in which we are increasing our dependency on NRIC is also a trend that is not new and not isolated to the crisis. Continuing in this direction will have long-term trade-off and consequences, which again, we can talk about in another video. Let me come to an end by showing you this interesting chart, which shows our GDP versus the wage share of GDP. Singapore has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world, despite our declining GDP performance, but we have one of the lowest wage shares in the world, and that's because we have very low corporate taxation and we have relatively high bias towards allowing companies and rich individuals to retain their profits. We don't tax capital gains, and we have very low corporate taxation on profits. The net consequence of that is that workers benefit from between 43 and 46% of total GDP, which is why it's a certain irony when we talk about GDP per capita being as high as $65,000 US. In reality, very few people in Singapore actually earn that amount on an annualized basis. And that has consequences, both political and social. And at some point, when more people realize this, I think we'll have to start to change the way we think about managing this distribution of growth or the benefits of growth. So let me leave you with a couple of questions. Is high dependency on FDI an unmitigated good? How much should we continue to depend on NRIC for revenue? Is wage share per GDP really equitable? And how will Singapore manage the economic crisis going forward in the next 12 to 24 months? And I'll try to tackle some of these questions over a series of videos that will come out over the couple of weeks. But hopefully you found enough information in this particular short video to whet your appetite. And I did say I'll try to do it in 5 minutes, but I took 12. Hey, we all overshoot. I'll see you another day, another time on the same channel.